This video is about the history of campaign finance. Now, Mark Hanna, from a long time ago, once said, there are two important things in politics. The first is money. The second, I don't remember. What we need to learn from that is, like water, money always finds a way. Our first stop in the timeline of campaign finance history is 1971. Why 1971? Because that's when the Federal Election Campaign Act was passed. And that is the law that basically governs campaign finance to this day. Now, it's being reauthorized several times along the way, but it began in 1971. Prior to 1971, this is what we need to know about campaign finance, is that contributions were banned from foreign nationals, from corporations in 1907, from public utilities in 1935, and unions in 1943. Now, I'm not saying that this is important, but let's say down the road you're asked to draw some similarities or draw some differences. You might want to know your vocabulary. So let's take a look at the word contribution. Contribution is the money that is received by a campaign. You can think of it also as the money given by a person to the campaign. Sometimes it is referred to as a receipt, the money that's received, okay, by a campaign from a person. Keep that in mind. You should also know what these entities are. When we're talking about foreign nationals, it's exactly that. We're talking about foreign corporations, foreign citizens, citizens of Germany, citizens of Saudi Arabia. Okay, they are not allowed to contribute to our political campaigns. Also, corporations. Okay, you understand what a corporation is. Contributions banned. Public utility might not be as familiar with that. So you think about that company that provides electricity. Okay, that company that provides water or gas to a community. It's often owned by the public, okay, or in trust. Okay. Contributions banned. Unions, just think teachers unions. I'm a teacher. I'm a member of a union. My union cannot directly give to a campaign. So what did the Federal Election Campaign Act do? Well, it did these things right here. It requires the reporting of contributions and expenditures. So if I'm running for office, I have to report my contributions, the money that I've received, and I have to report my expenditures, the money that I've spent. Again, at this point, focus on the vocabulary. Know the difference between the terms. Contributions, money received. Expenditures is the money spent by a campaign. The Federal Elections Campaign Act also requires that we disclose, if I'm running for office, that I disclose who has given me money. Okay, so disclosure is listing the names of people that have actually given me money. Then we move on to this right here. It establishes limits on expenditures. So it put limits on how much money a campaign could actually spend on certain types of advertising. And finally, it allowed for unions and corporations to form what we call political action committees. Now, unions and corporations are both prevented from giving money directly from their treasury to a campaign. But what they can form are these voluntary organizations called political action committees. And then they ask their membership to voluntarily donate money to that political action committee. So if I'm in the teachers union itself can't give money to a candidate, but they could form a political action committee, then every member of the teachers union can voluntarily give money to that political action committee, and then the political action committee can give money to the candidate. Okay, so it's on a more voluntary basis, but this was formalized, it was legalized in the 1971 version of the Federal Election Campaign Act. As stated earlier, like water, money always finds a way. So whenever the government tries to put restrictions on contributions, restrictions on expenditures, you're going to see that people figure out pretty quickly how to get around those restrictions. So you think of it as a loophole. And we have a loophole that was created already. How did money get around this particular law and into the hands of politicians running for office? Well, the big failure of the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1971 is there was no enforcement. And if there's no enforcement, no legitimate enforcement of the law, people just kind of ignored it. This image represents our next stop in the history of campaign finance timeline. If you look at the image carefully, the year's 1972, you could probably figure out what it is representing. This image represents the Watergate scandal. So burglars were caught in the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. It's later found out that those burglars were linked to the president's re-election committee. So this is President Nixon, and he had hired burglars to tap the phones and to steal documents at the Democratic National Campaign headquarters, okay, in the Watergate Hotel. He had raised hush money for these purposes. So he had gotten around the Federal Elections Campaign Act. He had failed to actually report those contributions, those expenditures, and disclose the donors from which he had got that pool of money. So really, Watergate was a campaign finance violation, and it highlighted the big loophole, the big drawback in the 1971 version of that law, that there was no enforcement. So after Watergate scandal played out, which resulted in the resignation of the president, right? Then they went back and they reauthorized the Federal Election Campaign Act. They tweaked it a little bit and gave it an enforcement provision. So in 1974, after the Watergate fiasco, Congress went back and revised the Federal Election Campaign Act. And in black here, you can see where they made the revisions. They put limits not just on expenditures, the amount of money campaigns could spend. They also put limits on contributions, the amount of money that campaigns could receive. Okay? They also created an enforcement arm. So they created the Federal Elections Commission, which still exists today. The Federal Elections Commission is made up of 6 voting members, and they basically enforce the law. They decide with the majority vote whether or not someone has violated campaign finance law. This is a bipartisan group, so no more than 3 individuals can be of any one political party. They also allowed for the public financing of presidential campaigns. So if I'm running for president and I'm having problems collecting money, I can actually receive money from the government to make me competitive. Okay? This is like a checkoff on my taxes. You can check off boxes if you want to donate to this fund. And then if someone runs for president, their campaign can be publicly financed. Now, these revisions lasted only for a very short time because they were the constitutionality of these revisions were challenged almost immediately. So we'll talk about Buckley v. Valeo. The next stop in our history of campaign finance timeline is 1976 in the Supreme Court case Buckley v. Valeo. So it was shortly after the revisions to the Federal Election Campaign Act, and it was challenged. The constitutionality of that law was challenged. The basis for the challenge was whether the requirements of the law violated the Constitution, specifically the free speech clause of the Constitution. Okay, now Buckley v. Valeo is not a required Supreme Court case. You do not need to know this for the AP test down the road later in the year. So you don't need to know the facts surrounding the case. However, you do need to know the holding. So the question was whether or not the restrictions were constitutional. The court basically decided in their holding, in the decision, yes and no. In their ruling, the court drew a very important distinction between contributions and expenditures. They upheld the limits on contributions. And so the contributions themselves did not necessarily equate to free speech. And they said that enhancing the integrity of our representational democracy was extremely important. So they said, trying to avoid corruption in the system or the appearance of corruption is a good thing to do. So they upheld those limits on contributions. What they did find to be unconstitutional was the limits on expenditures, the amount of money campaigns and outside organizations could spend. And they said, spending money equates to free speech, that money itself is speech if it's being spent. Okay? So if expenditures are speech, let's be clear. That meant that if I'm a candidate running for office, I can spend as much money as I have because that is speech. If I have my own personal wealth, there is no limit on how much money I can spend to see my political goals achieved. That is speech. If I'm an outside group, I can spend as much as I want because that is speech. So the key with Buckley v. Valeo was distinguishing between contributions and expenditures. One was equated to speech, the other was not necessarily equated with speech. So the number one lesson when talking about campaign finance is just to remember that, like water, money is always going to find a way. So after the Supreme Court made their ruling in Buckley v. Valeo that contributions could be limited, guess what? A new loophole developed to get around that ruling, to get around the limits on contributions. What we see created is this concept of soft money, where hard money is the money that's given directly to a candidate to help them win so they can run ads that say, vote for me. Soft money is going to be spent in different ways. And there were no contribution limits on soft money. So it was a way around the wall. And usually it was both the Democratic and Republican parties themselves. And what they did is they raised unlimited amounts of soft money. Unlimited amounts of soft money. And they could use it for party building activities. They could use it for voter mobilization. They could use it for expenses unrelated to the campaign. So anything that would, allow your party to basically operate, but didn't say vote for this candidate, right? They could even run issue ads, educational ads about an issue. And as long as it didn't say vote for this person or vote against that person, it was deemed okay. And what happened, though, is that it wasn't just the parties that was raising the soft money. All of a sudden, campaigns started to raise it as well. Okay? And you will see that, yes, there was the appearance that it led to corruption. And that's when we get concerned. So our next stop in the history of campaign finance timeline is 2002. With the passage of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, otherwise known as McCain-Feingold. McCain, Republican senator, Feingold, a Democratic senator. What they sought to do was just flat out ban the collection of soft money by political parties. That was the first requirement of the law. Parties would no longer be able to collect unlimited amounts of money for those purposes that were listed as soft money purposes, okay? Then they also had the requirement to stand by your ad provision. So you know that. That's whenever you watch a political ad and it says, I am this candidate and I approve this message. That is the stand by your ad provision. And finally, it banned outside issue ads from being run within 60 days of a general election and 30 days of a primary. Because now these issue ads were ones that named a candidate. Because they were run and they were often, they didn't say vote for or vote against, but they would say, tell this political candidate how you feel about this particular issue. So they often had an impact on the election itself, even though they were technically about educating voters about the issues. So recognizing their influence in campaigns, they said, you know what, we're going to ban them within a certain time frame of the election. So if it was a general election, you couldn't run those types of ads within 60 days. If it was a primary election, you couldn't run those ads within 30 days. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act was very effective. It effectively banned political parties from collecting soft money. But what's the one adage, the one thing that we always have to remember about campaign finance?
Money like water finds a way.
That's right. There's always going to be a loophole. Okay? Like water, money finds its way. Okay, so the way around the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act was not to give soft money to political parties, but instead to give it to 527 groups, which were issue groups. They were organized around an issue, and they would support that issue and their preferred solution to the issue, not necessarily a candidate, right? But they could inform you about a candidate's position on their issue. They just couldn't directly ask you to vote for or vote against that candidate. Okay, so it was a little shady sometimes, right? They avoided the contribution limits so they could collect as much money as they wanted, and they can run ads. Now, they were banned from running ads close to the elections, right? Especially if they named a particular candidate, but that's where the money went. Once it couldn't go to political parties, it went to these 527 groups. Just a couple more stops in our timeline. So our last stop on our history of campaign finance timeline is Citizens United versus the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. Now, this is a required Supreme Court case that you need to know. Okay, so you will need to know the facts of this case. So the year is 2008, and a group, nonprofit group that had some corporate financing called Citizens United put together a movie called Hillary, the movie. And the whole point of this movie was to persuade people not to vote for Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primary. Okay? And so the Federal Elections Commission basically said, you know, this violates the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. This is basically an ad that's advocating for the defeat of a particular candidate. And you can't do that according to this law. So Citizens United sued, and they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, the question before the court was then, does a law that limits the ability of a corporation to spend money to advocate the election or defeat of a candidate, does that violate the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech? And what the court said was yes. They said that corporations, like individuals, have free speech rights. Therefore, it kind of reversed that trend all the way from 1907, that corporations can directly advocate for the election and defeat of a candidate. They just can't coordinate directly with the candidate, but they can put out their own ads that say, vote for this person, vote against this person. You're going to see, because of this court decision, just a huge influx of money into politics through what we call super PACs. I'm going to let a different video kind of explain that to you. You just need to know that Citizens United said that money is speech, kind of reaffirm that concept, that money is speech, that corporations are individuals, along with unions and other groups, and they have free speech rights. They can spend money to directly advocate for the election and defeat of candidates. All right, thank you. Some final thoughts and warnings about campaign finance. We know that, like water, money finds a way. So that we know that if I want to avoid the contribution limits and give as much money as I want to, I can do that by donating to a super PAC. Okay? And which is what's created by corporations so that they can directly advocate, and unions, so that they can directly advocate for a particular candidate. I can give a certain amount of money to the candidate themselves, and then I can give the rest of my money to a super PAC, and they can help that candidate get elected as long as they don't coordinate. Now, what about the disclosure requirements? What if I don't want people to know that it's me that's giving the money? In that case, I can give it to a 501c4 group, which is a social welfare group. This right here, we call dark money, because we don't know who's giving to these particular groups. They can collect unlimited amounts of money, just like a super PAC. However, I don't know who gives the money to these groups, okay? Now, an example of a social welfare group, if I'm going to look at a 501c3, that'd be the Humane Society. Seems pretty legit, right? They have an actual mission statement that they're trying to achieve. The Americans, the AARP, which is a retirement organization advocating for the benefits and the rights of retirees, right? That's a legitimate, 501c4. And there might be legitimate reasons why we don't. You want to keep your gift to that particular group private. But here's the problem. If I'm a foreign national, if I'm a foreign government, and I want to influence the United States elections, I can do that now by giving money to this particular group, because no one's going to know that it comes from a foreign source. And then they can run ads and they can spend that money to influence the election. All right. There you go. Campaign finance history in a nutshell.